I think we left off around here, looking at certainly the plant will get a lot of benefit with this partnership with the mycorrhizal fungi. And the phosphorus in particular is a big deal. We see that phosphorus uptake is greatly augmented when the plant partners with mycorrhizal fungi, but also nitrogen and potassium. So overall, you're going to get a stimulation of seedling growth because they get more water, more minerals. And then we talked about this idea that there can be both physical and chemical protection for the plant as well. And then in return, the plant is feeding the fungus primarily sugars. And I think we left off here with the idea that there's plenty of evidence, many different species of plants. It's become such a well-known idea that implementing mycorrhizal fungi into your seedlings, or even when you put the seeds in the soil, is a good idea, and that it can greatly improve plant health, biomass, what you want. If you're going for food production, the parts that are edible are enhanced. So something to think about. I routinely use mycorrhizal fungi, even in my potted plants at home that I want to keep luxuriantly growing. I will sprinkle some of that in there, but also in my garden and playing around with it in my hydroponic situations that I have in my home as well. So mycorrhizal fungi are amazingly helpful, and they're studying more about them. I'll talk a little bit more about them when we get into further in the content. We're going to look at specific minerals and some of the things that they're doing, especially with phosphorus. But I wanted to go over this idea a little bit. So this is trying to demonstrate the idea of, if you have organic fertilizers like manure or just decomposing plants, like wheat straw or something like that. And then you have another option where you have the so-called synthetic fertilizers, which are inorganic fertilizers that are synthetic. So that means they're person-made in a lab somewhere, and then they get sprayed into or irrigated into the soil. And what they're trying to show here is that the synthetic fertilizers tend to do a direct action where you have the fertilizer getting applied and the plant can immediately take them up. So it's a very immediate response. And for that reason, it's very attractive to use inorganics. On the other hand, when you have organic, you see that they're trying to show that this is a slower process. You'll have organic matter that's more complex. It needs to be broken down by organisms in the soil, primarily microbes, bacteria and fungi. And then they release the nutrients, more fully broken down and into the water solution so that the plant can then take them up. So it's the action primarily of microbes in the soil with organic fertilizer that allows for the plant to finally get access to the minerals that come from that breakdown. And that's also really good too. So it just depends, when you look at conventional farming, synthetic has been the standard. That's what you do. And there's a whole backstory to all of that. But in a nutshell, my readings, the backstory that I've learned is that synthetic fertilizers really came out of the war, World War II in particular, where these big companies were manufacturing chemicals to kill the enemy. And now they're like, well, now what do we do? Now that there's peace, what do we do? And so they said, well, let's kill some plants. And so in a nutshell, that's kind of what they did. So then they turned their attention to the agricultural industry and said, how can we grow, crops without weeds present in the soil, getting, that competitive share. So synthetic fertilizers were born for crop production. And people kind of went by the wayside with this idea of organic fertilizer, which had been kind of an ongoing thing up until that point. So I'm not bad-mouthing synthetic fertilizers in general. I'm critical of them when they're overused. That's the thing. And so I use synthetic fertilizers in my garden and in my potted plants. I tend to do it in a very diluted way, but Sure, it's beneficial, absolutely. But when you overuse them, that's what I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to you about, because this overuse, there's many, for example, many agricultural fields that have been farmed for decades and decades with too much synthetic fertilizers going into the system. And so it's this chronic overuse over time. And it can, there's many ways that you can see the soil get damaged by this. It could be that it creates mineral imbalances, too much of one thing, not enough of another. And that can really mess up not only the plant, but also what's going on in the soil in terms of the microbe composition. You get heavy metal buildup, toxic metals, heavy metals. So that's not good for any organism. You tend to see a more acidic pH dropping below that 5.5, 6.5, and also salinity. So you get more salts building up in the system, because really when you look at it, fertilizers are a salt. When they make them synthetically, many of them are salts. And so now what you're doing is you're messing with the psi sub S of the soil. You're making that more and more negative, all these salts, and that's creating a difficulty for the plant to get access to water. And so that can be a real problem. So you tend to see overall with overuse that you get a decrease in microbial populations, a decrease in microbial diversity, and of course, plant health and overall biomass is going to suffer because of that. And I think if you've taken like BI 210, Intro to Ecology, or our upper level ecology class, I think, well, many of our classes, I'm sure this gets put out there in several of our classes, this idea of diversity, that the greater diversity you have in an ecosystem in general, they say that tends to make a very healthy ecosystem. Greater diversity, greater health. And so if you start messing with the diversity of the soil in terms of the microbes, they're realizing how negatively impactful that can be for the plant. So when you look at the idea of like overusing those fertilizers, where those salts, the fertilizer salts start to build up, again, you're messing with the psi sub S of the water potential equation. And that makes your psi sub S very negative or lowers it. And it can basically even create situations where the roots can't bring in water. In fact, it can be just the opposite, where water gets sucked out of the roots, out of the plant, because water will move from less negative to more negative water potentials. If your psi sub S in the soil is so low, you're going to get more negative water potentials around the roots out in the soil. And so you're going to get water flow in the wrong direction. And so this can happen under extreme conditions of salt buildup. So here they have a mock-up of two beakers with water, and the beaker A on the left did get spiked with salt. And they're trying to show that it's wilting. Even though the roots are sitting in water, it's wilting, because what's happening is that salty water has such a negative water potential. It's actually sucking water out of the roots. So it's really quite amazing, but that can happen. You can really create that kind of situation. So they often refer to that as fertilizer burn. If you've ever heard that phrase, that's usually what the person saying that means, is that there's so much salt buildup, fertilizer buildup in the soil system that you're getting loss of water from the plant. So inorganic fertilizers in and of themselves aren't evil, but they have to be used very judiciously. And chronic overuse is happening in our many agricultural soils, and that's creating that so-called microbial desert that I mentioned before, which is becoming a real problem. So I like this quote, we don't grow plants, we grow the soil. The soil grows the plants. I think that's a very beneficial way to look at how to grow plants. You look at what you're providing to them, And if you can provide to them a really diverse, rich in organic matter, inorganics, good cation exchange, good soil texture, lots of microbial diversity, if you can create that, you'll end up with plants that are healthy and happy. So this idea that growing the soil, one of my former grad students, Andrew, he got his master's here and he was looking at how to improve degraded soil using organic amendments and biochar and looking at microbe composition. And then when he graduated, he took over a farm in Wisconsin and is putting all this into action where he is creating beautiful soil and he's seeing the payoff in terms of his production. He primarily grows vegetables, but he also uses these types of ideas for creating good grassland he also raises cattle and pigs and chickens. And so, just applying these ideas of creating a healthy soil, and you end up with good products at the end. So I see it in action with one of our former students. This is an interesting quote from Justus von Liebig, or statement about that. So he was one of the originators of let's turn chemical warfare, out of the war effort and turn it into doing that for crop production and getting rid of weeds and other things. Later in his life, von Liebig acknowledged a grave mistake in relying only on chemistry. In fact, he saw the negative impacts of artificial fertilizers on life in the soil in his own vegetable garden, and thereafter preferred organic matter to the inorganic fertilizers he invented. After I learned the reason why my fertilizers weren't effective in the proper way, I was like a person that received a new life. Understanding how nutrients work will make us all see the light and ultimately make us better gardeners with more sustainable gardens. So this is a quote taken from a book by Jeff Lowenfels. The title of the book is Teeming with Nutrients. And so he's written several books, Teeming with Fungi, Teeming with Microbes, Teeming with Nutrients, all focused on the soil system and how to support good plant growth. And so this idea that, just going with straight inorganic fertilizers and everything's good. I mean, that was the long held belief. Oh, just throw some inorganics in there and everything's going to be fine. And we're learning that's not the case. Okay. So we have all these inorganic fertilizers. How do they even know what compounds the plant needs? Was a process. They had to go through and do some very careful studies. They had some really good guesses that turned out that their data supported it, or hypotheses, I should say. But the way to do that, working in a soil system is so complex. It's so complex. So they said, why don't we just turn to hydroponics and we'll create these recipes where we'll leave a nutrient out and we see what happens to the plant. And so they did a very methodical study like that, where they were feeding the plant different nutrients and creating deficiencies and just looking to see what would happen. So this was a long process, lots of effort going into this. Here you're just seeing a variety of hydroponic systems that are available for use. Hydroponics is definitely gaining in interest. As probably many of you know, we have an indoor agriculture program here at NMU that I and two other professors help implement. And then that got ramped into a minor. Well, it started with an associate's, then a minor, and now we have a controlled environment agriculture bachelor's degree that primarily is looking at hydroponic growth in terms of crop production, edible and medicinal as well. So here you're just looking at a variety of options, and that a lot of these we have in our indoor ag program in the labs that the students learn. And so basically you have a liquid recipe, and the one big concern is you have to provide enough air to the roots because the roots are alive and they need oxygen. So making sure that they get adequate air. And remember, oxygen diffuses fairly poorly in liquid. So that's an issue that you have to be aware of anytime you soak roots in a solution like this. If they're going to be permanently in the solution, you need to provide air bubbles. So that's what they're doing with that air stone. Or you could do a situation like this where you do the nutrient film technique where a lot of the roots are exposed and get plenty of oxygen with this pumping of the water and then returning. So it keeps circulating. So that's an option. You could do aeroponic where you mist the roots. And there's actually quite a bit of science going into this as well. They're getting into, well, how small should the water droplets be for effective use? So they're really looking at this as an opportunity because, of course, if you do aeroponics, you're using far less water, so it's more sustainable. And one of my grad students, Veronica, did her research with aeroponics. She was looking at aeroponics growth and adding in certain organic amendments, including beneficial bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi. And then she also did a soil-based experiment where she's comparing the two systems to see which method, how does that impact? If she worked with spinach, how does it impact spinach growth, the nutrient profile, the nutrient density? And so she's working on finishing up, writing all that up. But with the aeroponics, we were really interested because it is very sustainable. But there's some extra things to worry about, so to speak. You have to have a good adequate pump. The actual misting nozzles have to be functioning correctly and not get clogged. So there's a lot to it. But once you troubleshoot and get a system down, it's pretty good to go. Here's ebb and flow, where you have the water level coming up and then ebbing down. And so it keeps, circulating like that. And that's a nice idea as well. So lots of options. Back in the day when they were trying to figure all this out, they probably did more like the very first one I showed you, where it's more like this, where they just had the roots pretty much submerged and an air stone of some sort, and then testing all these different minerals and looking to see what happened to the plant when you provide them or when you deny them. So the hydroponic system, it's soil free. You have to provide aeration so the roots don't die. You need to be worried about too much light hitting the hydroponic solution. You don't want that because that tends to stimulate algae and cyanobacteria to grow that are in the hydroponic solution. They get in there one way or the other. One thing you have to a couple things you have to worry about is selective ion depletion, which is tricky. So let's say the plants really gobble up the nitrogen, so that becomes depleted, but the other nutrients are just fine. But being able to detect that and fix that can be tricky. Certainly pH changes are a little bit easier to keep it track of. And so that you have to be worried about too, that you don't get these drastic shifting going on. And then originally back in the literature, they're like, oh, mycorrhizal fungi, they can't do anything in a hydroponic system. That's useless. And now they're finding that to be false. More careful studies are showing that mycorrhizal fungi do persist in hydroponic systems and they can be helpful to the plant. So I thought that was an interesting kind of overturning of a long held philosophy about that idea. So also have other things besides just pure water. You could have the seedling starting to grow in sand. You tend to wash it with acid to kind of sterilize it. You could do that, have the roots in perlite as well. This is that white kind of little rocky stuff that you see in bags of soil and those little white kind of crumbly bits. That's perlite. And that is providing some good texture to your soil. Vermiculite looks like these little gold flakes that are much smaller than perlite, but vermiculite is also something that you could put the roots into perlite. So you can do just like pure perlite, pure vermiculite, and have the plant growing in that. There's some thought that that's a good idea because roots evolved in soil. Soil is a particulate matter. So it makes sense that that's what they're used to. That's what they evolved to have in their environment. And so providing the root system with something to grow through, something to push through, have that kind of texture. Some people think that that could be pretty important. That research is kind of lagging. I haven't seen much in the recent articles, but it's a nice thought. I understand the thought. It's pretty cool. So they had to figure this all out. What are the essential nutrients? And so basically they said, okay, this is how we'll define it. In its absence, the plant can't complete a normal life cycle. Somewhere along the way, they falter, can't make it through all the way to produce seed. Maybe it is also something that is an essential plant molecule. It's part of some plant molecules. So a really good example of that is magnesium is needed to make chlorophyll, because when you look at the chemical structure, chlorophyll has magnesium chelated right in the center of its so-called head region. I'll show you a picture later. So this is something that would make it an essential nutrient. Obviously, if you don't have chlorophyll up and running, you're not going to make it as a plant. So then they further break it down. They say, okay, that's how we define essential. Then they learned that there's macronutrients, which just means that, yeah, we need these, or I should say the plant needs these in large amounts. And it's usually because they're involved in making some part of the plant body. It's like part of the plant body. And obviously then you need a lot of it. So macronutrients, and then there's micronutrients required in small amounts, but that doesn't mean you should take them lightly. There's some, I mean, they need them. They have to have these micronutrients because these are the nutrients that usually help with physiological reactions. They form some kind of catalytic role, regulatory role of the physiological pathways. So still really important. They just aren't needed in very big amounts. Okay. This table from your book is showing relative amounts that you see with the different nutrients. So macronutrients here. So you see that nitrogen is winning in terms of overall amount. And they put it, I think they put this one relative to molybdenum. Everything's relative to molybdenum at the bottom, because molybdenum is needed in the fewest quantity, lowest quantity. Anyways, you see nitrogen wins. And then so, when you look at fertilizers, if you go to buy a thing of fertilizer, it's nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus typically that's provided. And so you can see that phosphorus, you would think, well, if almost any fertilizer you buy has an NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium is K. You'd think, well, they must be needed. Those three must be the highest, macronutrients, and it's not. You can see phosphorus is at 60,000, whereas potassium, 250, calcium is more than phosphorus. But phosphorus can be very challenging for a plant to get access to. So that's one reason why fertilizers have, store-bought fertilizers have phosphorus. And phosphorus can be very important in some very key roles of the life cycle of the plant. So if you're going for growing plants for food production or medicinal, where you need a biomass at the end to harvest, you need phosphorus. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But here you have a table where they group it. And so this table, I would like you to know how they're grouping them and be able to give an example. So group 1, 2, 3, 4, you see that there's certain nutrients that are part of carbon compounds. So nitrogen, of course, is part of like amino acids and proteins and so on, nucleotides. Sulfur too is part of amino acids. Group 2, you're looking at structural, either energy storage or structural. So phosphorus, of course, ATP is, has phosphates. But you also have phosphorus in nucleic acids and coenzymes. All right. Group 3, ionic. So that means when the plant takes it up, it just stays in an ionic form, doesn't shift. And so potassium, calcium, magnesium, and so on. And then they give some examples of what they do for the plant. And then the last group is redox reactions, which we'll talk quite a bit about, because when you look at photosynthesis, it's a series of redox reactions that are going on. So iron, manganese, copper, nickel, molybdenum. So please study this table. Probably on the next exam, the way I would ask you about this content would be to give you some hints, enough hints, so that if I want you to answer phosphorus, for example, I would say that they're important in energy storage and structural integrity, and then I'd say a little bit about what's in here. And then you'd give me phosphorus. All right, so I try to give you enough clues that if you didn't have a full memory of it, at least a partial memory of it, will get you there. Does that make sense? Okay, so as you're studying this table, I think if you group that in your head and then keep track of, who belongs into each group. And then usually if I provide enough tips, enough clues, the students, historically have done pretty well on this. And I tend to focus on ones that you'll see in some of my slides here in a minute here, that I take some of these and we talk more about them. So after all this research looking at macro, essential nutrients, which ones are macro, which ones are micro, then Dr. Hoagland came up with a nutrient solution. So that's, you probably, if you're involved in hydroponics at all, you probably heard about Hoagland solution. And there's all kinds of modified Hoagland solutions out there. It's kind of amazing how many options you do have. But basically, I just wanted, you don't have to like study this or anything. I just wanted to bring to your attention that yes, they have devised pretty standard solutions, recipes, and it's based off of Hoagland's work. And that's why it's called that. And basically it's a mixture of the macronutrients, micronutrients in the right proportions that don't cause problems for the plant, but give them enough nutrients to complete their life cycle. Okay, so let's say you have the plant growing either hydroponically or in a soil system, and they start to take up these minerals that are dissolved in the water and bring them into their body. Then there's a couple of options on what can happen to those minerals. So if it's a so-called mobile mineral, what that means is when the plant brings it up into their body, they can redistribute it over time when needed. So let's say the plant takes up some calcium, gets that in, and let's say it puts that calcium in some of its stem tissue. And then there's a baby leaf starting to grow. And that baby leaf goes, calcium's not the best one to pick. Let's say it's potassium. Let's go with potassium, okay? And the baby leaf is like, eek, I'm running low of potassium. Then the stem can go, well, I can give you some. And it will mobilize to the baby leaf. And so mobile means that once it's taken up, it's not like fixed in place. It can get rerouted to where necessary. Immobile, on the other hand, is that once it's taken up and put in place, that's it. It's not going to share and redistribute. So we are so still that the lights went off. What does that say about us? Are we a little sleepy? Or you're so focused on learning that you're just like captivated and won't move? Okay. So mobile versus immobile, and that's important. And if you understand that, then when you look at your plant and if it's suffering and there's some kind of deficiency going on, this can be a good way for you to start picking out what is deficient. If you can keep track of what minerals are mobile versus immobile. So this one here is a good one. I would like you to memorize this. I find the best way to memorize this is stick with what's immobile, it's shorter. And so if you just memorize that, then we'll say all the rest is mobile. So that would be an easy way to do it. CSI, someone says, oh, it's like the show CSI. Remember that show CSI? So that's how someone in previous class listened or memorized it. Calcium, sulfur, iron, boron, and copper are considered immobile. However, there's one on the mobile list. So this is an older table where I put zinc in parentheses. There's debate about zinc. Depends who you talk to and which resource you look at. Some people call it mobile and some say it's immobile. So I would like you to be aware of that. Zinc is tricky. And as far as I know, the story is still out. Although, let's see, this one is from Cornell University, and they're calling zinc immobile. So when I'm talking about mobile versus immobile, I'm focusing on what's happening once the plant takes it up. All right, that's what I'm talking about right now. This table also looks at how mobile it is in the soil, but we won't get into that. So this is a more extensive table than what is in your book. But for what I'm asking, go with this one. All right, and then just be aware zinc is an issue. All right, so let's say the plant is taking up these minerals, but then starts to have a lack of a certain mineral. And then it will start to display deficiency symptoms. And in general, there's a couple of things you can say. You might see the leaves turning yellow. Then we say it's going through chlorosis. When you look at the leaf, you look at the pattern of yellowing. What kind of pattern are you seeing? Is it just across the leaf all the way, all the same? Then we just say, oh, that's general chlorosis. If the yellowing is spotty, like literally there's spots and patches, then we call it mottled chlorosis. And then if it is where the veins are still popping green, but the rest of the tissue is yellow, so it's in between the veins that you have yellowing, then we call it interveinal. So when you look at your plant and you see this chlorosis, all of that can give you clues on what kind of deficiency you're dealing with. Is it general? Is it mottled? Is it interveinal? And then if that poor plant continues to suffer, the chlorosis shifts to necrosis. Necrosis is dead tissue. That means even if you spike it with everything it needs, that tissue is never coming back. Whereas chlorosis, sometimes you can save it. Sometimes you can regreen those leaves, but and the same with necrosis. You could have general, mottled, or well, not really interveinal because it's all dead. But the necrosis tends to be tan or brown or black tissue that you're looking at. Now, if you're a plant doctor, and by the way, that's actually a thing, you can go and get an advanced degree similar to a medical degree for humans. You can get a plant doctor degree. And in some ways, I think it's more challenging to be a plant doctor than a human doctor. Lots of extra things you have to think about in terms of the environment impacting the plant. So when you look at plants, you have to take so much into account, but certainly looking at what does the plant look like? Here, they're just giving you some ideas of what it might look like. So it's a little greeny, but and then the other thing I wanted to show here is that when you look at a plant, the newer growth is by the apical meristem. So the base of the stem, that part of the plant is the oldest in terms of the leaves. So these are the oldest leaves down here, youngest leaves up top. All right. So then you can get a feel for if, for example, there's a nutrient here that's mobile and one of these younger leaves needs it, they'll send it up to the newer, vigorously growing leaves, and then they'll start to show a symptom first. The young growth will be fine. But the older leaves, because they sacrifice some of their nutrients, the younger, they start to show symptoms. So the timing of, is it an older leaf? Is it a younger leaf? Looking at that can also tell you quite a bit about what it might be that's deficient. So general chlorosis, mottled chlorosis, nitrogen deficiencies. Here's a nice one of interveinal. So training your eye to look for this kind of thing, even just with your houseplants, can go a long way for trying to find out, what do you need to do to help that plant out. And so very often you'll turn to fertilizers. And like I said, when you go to buy some fertilizer at Walmart or Menards or whatever, you'll look on the package and it'll be an NPK ratio that they'll give you. And it's always in that order. And when you look at, in general, nitrogen is very good for the shoot growth, really nice leaf production. Phosphorus is great for supporting root health, and then also shifting into flowering stage. Having enough phosphorus is important. And then potassium is just great overall. They need a lot of potassium for a variety of things. And so, and it also helps them prepare for winter. It's an important process. So those are the three big ones. You can buy other fertilizer out there or make your own by mixing things yourself, certainly. But that's these three are so critical for many phases of the plant life, and they're needed in fairly good amounts. So I wanted to go over, NPK in a little bit more detail. When a plant is getting access to nitrogen from the soil, most plants prefer to take up nitrate, NO3-, that's nitrate. So that's like one of their favorite. Nitrate. Boy, sorry, sloppy, nitrate. And then NH4 plus is ammonium. So some plants, I think cranberry likes ammonium a little bit more than any other, but nitrate tends to win in terms of that's very popular. Then they'll take that up and they usually quickly work on it to change it to ammonium. And then that typically quickly gets used for building amino acids and proteins, hormones. Na is nucleic acids, chlorophyll, CHL is chlorophyll. So hugely important molecules for the plant. So they need a lot of it. It's the most abundant, they just need it in very high quantities. So if they have a nitrogen deficiency, you'll tend to see stunted growth. The growth slows down. They start to become more dwarf-like in their overall growth. General chlorosis is very common, and it's mobile, which means when it's in the plant body, if a younger leaf, for example, I'm low on nitrogen, the older leaves will tend to shift it and get it to the younger leaves. So it's mobile. So that means that if you see deficiencies showing up in older leaves first, it tends to tell you it's a mobile nutrient that you're dealing with, because the older leaves start to turn yellow, the younger leaves are still doing okay. So it must be a mobile nutrient that is moving out of the older leaves, and now the older leaves start to suffer first. And then if things continue, eventually the whole plant will suffer, but mobile means the older parts show the symptoms first. Another weird thing that you see that's kind of a nice tip-off for a couple of these deficiencies, one of them being nitrogen, if you turn the leaf over and look at the underside, you'll often see like a purplish hue to the leaf tissue. Sometimes it's on the petioles as well, the leaf blade or the leaf stalk. And so look, anthocyanin is a purpley reddish pigment. So look for that as well. Nitrogen deficiency, but also phosphorus deficiency will do that, anthocyanin. Here they're showing nitrate being brought in, or ammonium being brought in. And ammonia is really the only one that can go straight through. So NH3 is ammonia. And that they're showing that's not a problem to just get it to go through the membrane straight through. Whereas all the other, because they're charged, they need to go through a transport protein to get in. And you can see in this case, they're demonstrating the idea of primary active transport where you have ATP being used to create a proton gradient. So that's your PAT idea. And then your secondary active transport is happening all over here where they have that proton moving in and dragging a nitrate with it, or here they have potassium going in and dragging ammonium. So that if it's potassium, they didn't need to expend ATP necessarily, but. So you have, I'm just trying to show that there's, depending on which form of nitrogen, there might be some different strategies going on in order to get it in. Phosphorus is usually taken up as the form H2PO4 minus. That's pretty easy for the plant. If the soil shifts to alkaline, then phosphorus turns into HPO4 3 minus. You don't need to necessarily memorize exactly the chemical structure. I'm more concerned that you understand that if, in this case, you go a little alkaline, phosphorus becomes virtually unavailable. In general, it is a pretty good rule of thumb that the concentration of soluble phosphorus, okay, the concentration of soluble phosphorus in soil is low. So they're being very specific there, soluble phosphorus. So what they're saying is you could have a ton of phosphorus in the soil, but it's bound up or precipitated out where the roots can't get adequate access to it without help. And even then it can be a slow process. So this idea of precipitated out, insoluble, all that means that it's unavailable to the plant directly. And so even if you take a soil sample and send it off and say, hey, tell me how much phosphorus is in this, you can get your soil analyzed. They usually report back two things. They'll give you overall phosphorus content, and then they'll give you available phosphorus content because they recognize that they don't always line up. And so that's a problem. If you go super acidic or even to neutral, conditions of pH in the soil, you can often see phosphorus attaching to aluminum or iron, which is not good because then it becomes unavailable. If you go way into alkaline, basic soil means above pH, like pH 8 or something like that, it can bind up with other minerals, precipitate out. So again, it's insoluble. Plant can't get direct access to it. So phosphorus is a big deal for plants. They may see, so to speak, phosphorus all around them, and yet they can't touch it because it's insoluble or complexed, and they need help to get access to that. It's kind of weird because when you see plants that have phosphorus deficiency, their leaves actually look more green than the control plants that are getting adequate phosphorus. It's kind of weird. They intense green. You'll start to see black mottled necrosis and that anthocyanin pigment again. If you turn the leaf over and look carefully, you can often see that purpley red pigment. And then phosphorus is mobile. So that means older leaves that have plenty of phosphorus, if a young leaf is saying, hey, I need it, they'll send it up to the young leaf. And then the older leaves start to show the symptoms first. So this diagram is just trying to show again, like how does it take it in? And here, what they're trying to show is that you have ATP being used, so primary active transport to get a proton gradient. They're also seeing CO2 playing a role, where CO2, once it's in the soil water solution, can form the carbonate form, and then that can react with some of the phosphorus compounds on the soil particle. So that's what they're trying to show there, is that carbonate form is reacting and allowing for release. So there is that kind of mechanism at play where sometimes the carbon dioxide available can help solubilize. And then they're using Symport, that proton gradient, they're using that as a way to bring in the phosphorus. So that is a strategy that can work. It's not super quick or abundant, but it can happen. Here's a more directed method, I guess, where the plant deliberately is releasing citrate. And when they do that, it also solubilizes the phosphorus that's bound to the soil particle. So that's what they're trying to show, is that you get this reaction where the phosphorus becomes soluble and then the plant can take it up. Here's an enzyme, acid phosphatase, that's being released. And again, its action to help cleave off the phosphorus, other chemicals, and then bring it in. So there are some plants that can do this. Not all, not all plants will release citrate and the acid phosphatase. Carbon dioxide is something that all roots release because they're respiring just like you are right now. And so there are some ways for them to get access to it, but in general, this isn't adequate. When you look at, well, at least for growing, especially for growing plants for crop production, it doesn't happen enough through the growing season to allow for good biomass and yield. Typically. So that's why they tend to spike in phosphorus as one of the main fertilizers through the growing season. Okay, I guess we got to stop there. There's a few more things I want to say about some key nutrients. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of them. And then after that, we're going to start getting into, we're going to zoom in on nitrogen and look at how plants might be able to get access to nitrogen in more than one way. So we'll do that after this.